Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The tensions between Russia and the West over Ukraine are growing in recent days. Russia has stationed a large number of troops at the Ukrainian border, and some Western diplomats believe Russia is preparing to invade, a claim which Moscow denies. Talks between envoys from Russia and Ukraine, Germany and France were held in Paris on Wednesday. The Western countries have threatened Russia with political and economic sanctions, while Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov believes Russian security is an unconditional priority. On Wednesday, the U.S. and NATO gave formal responses to Russia's demands for NATO to stop expanding eastward and to rule out Ukraine joining the alliance. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the American response reiterates Washington's stance and sets out a path for diplomacy. Many regard the response as a rejection to Russia's demands, though the negotiations between Moscow and the West are still ongoing. Will there be a consensus? Let's loop in our panelists from Ukraine, Russia, and also from China. For more on Russia-Ukraine tensions, we are joined in Kiev by Peter Zamayev, who is the director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. In Washington, D.C., Anton Fedashian, professor of history from American University. In Beijing, Yang Xiyu, senior research fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Latest discussion between Russia and Ukraine. Do you see any real results, Mr. Zamayev?
Well, the world is kind of holding its breath. It seems like there's a diplomatic impasse, but for as long as diplomats are talking, it means that the guns are being silent. From all indications, by all accounts that we are hearing from Moscow, it seems that whatever the West has offered Russia so far is just not going to be sufficient. The West has drawn its own red line. It will not give in writing into Russia's demand that Ukraine never be admitted to NATO. I think Joe Biden, the American president, has already hinted that Ukraine is not going to be a member for the next 10 or more years. But the question is whether Russia will be satisfied with just this kind of informal opinion rather than having a solid promise in writing, which the West is not going to do.
Professor Fedashian, how much do you see as the danger of war or conflicts, real conflicts on the ground?
Well, I think the danger of war is fairly low, especially, these images of the Russians invading in full force as if we were going back to the Second World War. Now, there is a real danger of things going wrong on the ground, as things usually do when tensions are this high, and then drawing the other participants in. But I think neither Kiev nor Moscow are really actually interested in a major war, although there's also always a problem of the smaller, semi-independent local actors. But I think in general, my reaction to the news of the day, although it's still developing, is that although, as Piotr correctly noted, the Russians have not accepted the American response, there is movement forward on a set of sideline issues, as the Russians have put it, issues of military exercises, issues of missile deployment, and that may just be enough to actually keep talking and build confidence, however slowly. And there may be a way out of this if there's enough diplomatic finesse and grace and political will.
Worst scenario, best scenario. Of course, the worst scenario, military conflict, Mr. Zamayev. On the other hand, the best scenario could be use it as an initiative to bring Russia and the West, quote unquote, closer in terms of communicating with one another to solve some of the thorny issues. So which one do you see is likely to be the trend at this momentum?
Well, it seems like Vladimir Putin, has somewhat boxed himself in. It seems like he staked everything on military escalation, and the question is, what will be enough for him to save his face? To be able to walk away and say that he's achieved his goals. Possibly it will be a promise on the part of the West, to renegotiate the treaty, including on control of, intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe. Maybe that will be possible. It is also possible that Vladimir Putin is looking to other Western players, such as President Macron of France, who had his own initiative and the other day met in Paris as part of the Normandy talks format. And if that is the case, and France has had an experience mediating these conflicts, going back to 2009 in Georgia when President Sarkozy was mediating, then it will remain to be seen what Mr. Macron will try to do. And a possibility is trying to re-engage Ukraine and Russia on the Minsk agreements.
Professor Fedashian?
Yes, I think that the Minsk agreements are going to be one of the most important linchpin here, because they have been stalled, they have been frozen. There's been almost no movement on them for at least 2 years now. And this, in many ways, is the key to diffusing the immediate crisis, although this acute stage that we're in is only part of a much broader set of issues. Listening to the United States and Russia speaking to each other, I'm constantly struck by the fact that they're sort of operating on two different planes. The United States wants to reduce Russia's general complaints to the current issue of Ukraine and the troop buildup on its borders, whereas for the Russians, this is really a tactic. For them, there's a much broader issue here, and it has to do with Euro-Atlantic security, and that's something that the Americans don't seem to be ready or yet willing to discuss more broadly. So we'll see what happens.
Mr. Yang from Beijing, what is your take? China is not directly involved in this, but certainly a very interesting observer.
Yep. Actually, it is a dual crisis. On one hand, it's a crisis between Ukraine and Russia, but on the other hand, the bigger problem is a crisis on the crisis of geopolitical border in Europe, which has been written by the NATO eastward expansion. The key question for the second crisis is whether or not the rewritten borderline should be rewrite and how. So that is the bigger key question relating to all the strategic stability. And everything now is going dangerous and negative and sad. However, there's still a hope, say, the Minsk agreement. Everything is very difficult to solve, especially between Russia and the US. However, the turning point could be the Minsk agreement. As long as all the parties take a serious attitude and responsible thoughts, then I believe we can make the dual crisis in a soft landing path.
We hope that will be the case. However, Mr. Zamayev, you are based in Kiev. Tell me more about how much danger is there, people feel, that they are being, being put into a frame in which not them, but also others are likely to decide their fate, namely whether Ukraine, Russia, border will become, a new version of the Cold War to a certain extent, like the old Berlin or something. Because things are developing very fast geopolitically. Nobody can predict where we are today a year ago, but we are where we are today. So, Peter, tell me more about your thoughts.
Well, and you know what? No one could have predicted Russia's annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014. Considering your question about what Ukrainians are feeling, you have to consider the fact that they've been living in this environment for going on 8 years now. And so this is, the war is ongoing, except that obviously it's not felt in the capital city where we are right now in Kiev, but the war has been going on ever since. And so Ukrainians are kind of inured. They're used to this. Also, you have to add to this the fact that the Ukrainian government, for good or bad, has been trying to keep Ukrainians calm, assuring them that the danger is not imminent. When the intelligence services of the U.S. and other Western countries started ringing alarm bells like a month ago, the Ukrainians were like the last to catch on. Right now, the problem in Ukraine is mixed messaging. Mr. Zelensky started kind of imagining aloud what it would mean if, let's say, Russia invaded Kharkiv, a major city in the east, northeast of Ukraine. Coupled with these assurances not to panic, this creates sort of mixed messaging, and it creates and sows confusion on the part of Ukrainians. But let me just add that there is resolve. If you want to know about Russia's chances to occupy and keep Ukraine, something that Western intelligence services have actually also mentioned, this is probably not going to be very easy at all. Ukrainians are resolved to fight for their country.
Peter Zamayev, I know you have to catch a plane for now. Thank you so much for joining us, especially when you're standing outside for our interview. Really appreciate it, sir. Thank you so much. Professor Fedashian, let me further push a little bit on the Russian topic. You see, Ukraine and Russia have been having very good ties. In fact, a lot of Ukrainians work in Russia, and also the exchanges has been, quite warm, when it comes to people. So how do you understand, on the geopolitical level, things are very intense, at least in the media report. However, when it comes to what is under the surface, there are a lot of nice nuance going on, historically and right now too. So Professor Fedashian, tell me more about this complicated picture.
Well, you're right in the sense that the Ukrainian people and the Russian people feel a lot closer to each other today and have been throughout this crisis. There are parties in both countries that are sort of hell-bent on a more stringent, more difficult relationship. There's a lot of ideology on both sides. But in general, Russia and Ukraine really started parting ways in 2014 with the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, who had been a horrible president, but also a democratically elected one. And so it was from that moment that things really started going south. And it was particularly problematic for the Russian-speaking minority within Ukraine, because for those of us who watch this stuff very closely, the first decision that the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, made after Yanukovych was toppled was to strip the Russian language of its equal status as a state language in Ukraine. And that's a language that millions of Ukrainians speak. And that was sort of a signal that integration with the West will happen regardless of the interests of the Russian-speaking minority, which of course is the largest minority in Ukraine of all the minorities that it has. So this is where things really became increasingly politicized. And when you politicize things along an ethno-linguistic line, it is inevitably going to bleed into every single family, especially considering that for many Ukrainians, being Russian speakers and identifying as Ukrainian was never before an issue. But this decision by the EU to place Ukraine before an existential decision, either you're with the West or you're with the East, you're with the Russians, inevitably split the country through the eastern side, and we're still living with the consequences.
And final question also for Professor Yang. We see the Biden administration has been swaying among different possibilities when it comes to important geopolitical choices, whether it's China, Russia, or the U.S. role in on the international stage, in multilateral platforms. we haven't seen it's decided, complicated by the domestic chaos this administration is facing right now. So no solution for either way, domestic, international. So how do you see this chip, this card of Ukraine is likely to be in political campaigns and in the general political atmosphere in Washington beyond?
On the surface, it is foreign affairs in the U.S. politics. I mean, the Ukraine-Russian crisis is international affairs for American public policy. However, given the current political atmosphere in the United States, everything relating to Russia must be opposed or must be negative. So actually, Biden administration has manipulated this international affairs into the domestic politics. In other words, the domestic politics has been adapted to some degree the policy on the Ukraine crisis. The administration show any weaker post will got backfire. And by the same token, any advantages against Russia will gain domestic politics. So therefore, I think in the midterm election year in the United States, Biden administration will get a tougher position than the normal imagine, so that they can gain domestically.
Well, gentlemen, I have to say we've been struggling with politics for a while. It used to be a solution to a lot of complicated issues, but recent years, politics has become such an obstacle for all of us to search for the best solution. We hope that will change, but that remains still a hope. Thank you so much for both of you for shedding some light into a very complicated issue. Anton Vidashian, Yang Xiyu, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.